Good evening. Could you please settle in your seat, please? Thank you. And if I could ask you to turn your phones to vibrate or turn them off, please. Ladies and gentlemen, students, colleagues, distinguished guests, it's my privilege and great pleasure to welcome you here this evening. My name is Hugh McKenna and I'm Vice Chancellor of Research and Innovation. I'm going to use this opportunity for a few minutes to give you an overview of the University of Ulster, a little bit about the School of Education and IRIS, the Institute for Research in Social Sciences. Sir Ron Deering, one-time Chancellor of the University of Nottingham and the author of the Deering Report into Higher Education, said that in the Middle Ages, the centre of the community was a medieval castle. In the 18th century, it was the mills and the industries. Today, it is a university, he said. This is increasingly the case, considering the role universities have to play in reinvigorating the economy. The University of Ulster has a very important role to play in this. So for the uninitiated, I could tell you that the University of Ulster is the largest university on the island of Ireland. I believe you've just heard that we have 4 campuses here in Belfast, Magee, Coleraine and Jordanstown. And this is, in the future, in 2018 on, this will be our largest campus because we're doing quite a new build here. So we're truly a University of Ulster. This particular campus was known as the Art College and dates back to the middle 19th century, beg your pardon. Our core business in the University of Ulster is obviously teaching and research, and our students and staff strive for excellence because they work in an environment where knowledge is generated, challenged, tested, as well as being taught and applied. Evidence from a number of external league tables shows that we have a reputation for internationally competitive research, for innovation, and high standards in teaching, and for the quality of our students' experience. All of our courses provide graduates with the necessary employability talents to follow high-level professional pathways in a variety of public and private enterprises. We recognise that many of our graduates will work in services, businesses and industries that don't currently exist. So we inculcating them the skills of creativity, innovation, confidence and flexibility. Key skills that the future workforce will require and with which the School of Education excels. The school is the only hub for teacher education outside Greater Belfast. It offers a range of initial teacher education provision that is unique within Northern Ireland, including primary, post-primary and further education. Teaching and education in Ulster is very popular, and this invariably means that our courses are heavily oversubscribed. The school offers a distinctive pedagogical model based on collaborative, cross-curricular learning. For teachers, the school is developing flexible, part-time, full courses and short courses to support a career-long CPD framework for teachers. This includes subject specialisms in a wide range of expert practice, including leadership and headship. The community relations dimension and use of ICT to enhance teaching and learning are particularly long-standing strengths, each being informed by the research undertaken within the school. The innovative use of ICT to enhance learning and teaching focuses on the use of iPads, for example, for initial teacher education in local schools and the development of e-portfolios for professional learning. The school also has a substantial tradition of work in educational responses to conflict. This began in the early years of the Troubles with the groundbreaking Schools Cultural Studies project. It continues today in the ICT-enabled cross-community links of the Dissolving Boundaries project and in the Creative Change project. This is working with pupils, teachers and parents in all of the primary schools around our Coleraine campus. Inclusive educational practice has been a research focus in the school over an extended period of time, with an emphasis on special education needs and on social marginalisation. In addition, the interdisciplinary work of the UNESCO Centre and the Children's Youth Project is providing a wider vision in the experience of children and young people. The University of Ulster is proud of the fact that the School of Education has a record in providing first-class, internationally recognised, innovative and groundbreaking professional education, underpinned, I have to say, by rigorous research. Our staff are keen to work with government, educators and all those with an interest in the development of an educational system that gives all our children the best possible chance to reach their full potential, both as individuals and members of a wider society. Research within the school is coordinated through the Institute of Research in Social Sciences, IRIS, ably led by Cathy Cormac-Heenan. The Research Institute seeks to generate, disseminate and apply the highest quality research. It's somewhat unusual across the university in that it covers a wide range of disciplines. For example, social and public policy, social work, criminology, education, communications, linguistics and politics and international affairs. IRIS provides a strong institutional framework for the development of a vibrant research culture through the organisation of seminars, colloquia and lectures, and a forum for engaging with policymakers and those involved with service delivery in the public and voluntary sectors. This past year, IRIS was delighted to be working with the Research and Information Services at the Northern Ireland Assembly. The focus has been on delivering a series of policy-relevant seminars at Stormont, and this was part of the 2012-2013 Knowledge Exchange Seminar Series. These are tied particularly to the current programme for government. In conclusion, it's always good to say in conclusion, it gives your audience some hope. But in conclusion, the School of Education and the Research Institute retains a strong sense of place, performs unique roles in preparing educators to play their part in developing a hopeful and dynamic future for Northern Ireland, at peace with itself and with its neighbours. Now, why are we here this evening? The IRIS annual lecture is an opportunity for the policy-relevant engagement that I alluded to earlier on. And on such a glorious evening, this is our summer after all, we are really delighted that you're able to come along, and especially those who are involved in policy making. I know we are in for a treat. Tonight's lecture is hosted by the Educational Research Group within the Institute, led by the Head of School, Professor Linda Clark, and the Research Coordinator, Dr. Alan McCulley. I will now ask Linda to come to the podium to introduce our guest speaker. Linda.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you for choosing to do this as opposed to all the other things that we choose to do on the few sunny days we have here. It's great to see you here. Education is always in the news. It's always topical, it's always current, and always relevant. There's a recent, very small, very short guide to education by Gary Thomas that's just been produced. And he begins by making the point of the currency of education, but goes on by pointing out that despite all the headlines and all the lively debates, there is often a distinct lack of public knowledge about the intellectual traditions that have shaped education. The informed layperson could write a few sentences about about Marx or Einstein, or indeed Keynes. But could we find many lay members of the public who could write a few sentences about Dewey, about Piaget, about Freire, or about Gardner? Our key thinkers, and lots of others besides. A further and connected point, and an even more important point, I think, is that this lack of knowledge about the discipline of education is often combined by a tendency of the layperson to think they know a huge amount about education. All have been to school. All have been in classrooms for many years and shared those classrooms with a range of good teachers and bad teachers and creative teachers and maybe a few mad teachers besides. And thus it is unfortunately too often perhaps the burden, some would say the curse of education and of the teaching profession, that everyone thinks they are an educational expert. And sadly this seems to sometimes apply to government ministers too. Education, often their own personal school education, worked for them and they became government ministers. So QED, they think that they have got the perfect recipe for teachers and teaching. Sometimes goes along these sort of lines. I bet you can guess what these sort of lines are. Schools would be so much better if teachers would just bring back spelling and times tables and learning poems by heart, as if these things ever went away. Of course, pupils still build from the very youngest age what Seamus Heaney calls their word board, and indeed their number board, and very useful they are. Schools would be so much better if teachers were just to bring back some rigour into the classroom. Well, I've met many hundreds, perhaps thousands of teachers in my time, and I have never, ever met a good teacher who didn't believe in rigour. And finally, schools would be much better if we were just to bring back those hard-working, dedicated, inspirational teachers of our youth, as if they no longer existed. And of course, they do. Even in this room, they've got many dozens of them. And you all will be one. Of course, we are not troubled by such ministers in Northern Ireland. But we do hear of a Mr. Gove, who believes that he also knows how teachers should best be trained in schools and by other teachers. And yes, to an extent, this practical professional knowledge is important. Of course it is. But it's not the principal role of a serving teacher to teach student teachers. Their role is, and it has to be, primarily about teaching pupils, your son, my daughter, not the student teachers. And of course, this important praxis is not and cannot be all there is to teacher education. I believe that this point is widely recognised here in Northern Ireland. And here there is also a recognition that we should not take for granted the quality of students who choose to become teachers in Northern Ireland. For the brightest and most motivated students in Northern Ireland choose to become teachers. And these excellent teachers, these excellent student teachers, are also singularly capable of benefiting from the other key component of learning to teach. These students are capable of benefiting greatly from the contribution that university education departments bring to the work of becoming a teacher. These university education departments, which are the focus of tonight's lecture. And in this context, I am, of course, talking here about our two university colleges as well, so please take that as read. These student teachers can benefit from and can contribute to the rigorous and stimulating encounters with theory and with local and international research, which form the other key component of a thoroughly and thoughtfully professional professional. These talented student teachers have the capacity, in addition, to become the lifelong professional learners that their pupils deserve to have as their teachers. However, this is the point where I think teacher education in Northern Ireland currently falls down somewhat. We do not yet have the career-long CPD frameworks that other professions have. And I suspect that the lay person would probably be convinced that we do have such frameworks, but not yet. And this is, I believe, the next key challenge for university education departments and our excellent General Teaching Council as well. And these organisations will come into their own when they work together to produce this important next step. Our guest speaker tonight, Professor John Furlong, is very well placed to address this distinctive role of university departments of education. And he can help us to take this step forward at this key point in our deliberations about career-long teacher education. To an extent, Professor Furlong needs no introduction. He is that rarity. He is a well-known educationalist. But as we noted earlier, even well-known educationalists are probably not really well-known. In this case, there is so much to know. So you'll forgive me, John, if I just concentrate on a few highlights. Professor Furlong began his career as a teacher in London, completing his PhD whilst teaching, and moving to academia as a lecturer and a researcher, and later becoming a professor of education. In 2003, he became the director of Oxford University's Department of Education, a post which he held until 2009. John was a member of the 2008 RAE Education Subcommittee and is a member, subpanel, and is a member of the 2014 REF Subpanel too. He has a long-standing interest in the professional education and training of teachers, and his critical expertise in this field has been much in demand. In 2006, he led the review of initial teacher training provision in Wales for the Welsh Assembly Government. And closer to home, he was a member of the International Review Panel, which reported on initial teacher education provision in the Republic of Ireland just last year. He has also conducted a review of the work of SCOTEMS, the Standing Council on Teacher Education North and South, which is the cross-border body for teacher education. And this review has been a very helpful starting point for myself and Tomás O'Rourke, who are the incoming Northern and Southern chairs of SCOTEMS. John is a past president of BERA, the British Educational Research Association, and he played a key role in the recent launch of their inquiry into the relationship between educational research and teacher education. He has just published his most recent book, Education, the Anatomy of the Discipline, and here tonight he will share his thoughts on that anatomy. And so it's a very great pleasure I hand over to Professor John Furlong.
Well, thank you very much indeed, and thank you all of you for giving up such a lovely sunny evening to join me here this evening. It's always a delight to be in Belfast. I've been here many times, and I always get such a warm welcome from people. It's actually a really great city to be in. What I want to talk about is the book that I've recently published. It's actually I retired last September. Well, my wife would question that, but formally I retired last September. And as I was moving towards retiring, I wanted to kind of try to make sense of the field that I've been working in for the last 35 years or so, trying to make sense of what it is I'd done, what it is that was valuable about the area of the involvement of universities in the field of education. I did a lot of reading, I did a lot of historical research, for the first time understanding where I came from professionally. I did quite a lot of philosophical research. I also did some empirical research as well. I came to talk to some colleagues here in Belfast and in about 10 different departments of education across the UK. And I was bringing that stuff together, constantly asking myself, well, what is it that actually shapes the field that I've given my professional life to? You say my most recent book. I suspect it's only my last book. Well, it may not. Who knows? But anyway, and this is what I've called it, and that's what I want to talk a bit about tonight. Now, to talk about education as a discipline is itself quite controversial. But there are two ways of asking the question about a discipline. You can ask the question epistemologically or sociologically. If you ask a question epistemologically, you're asking questions about what constitutes a discipline in terms of its what counts as evidence, what theories it uses, what focus of topics it addresses. And if you look at education from that point of view, then it's clearly actually not a discipline at all, because it's immensely diverse. We use every single research method going. We use all sorts of different theoretical frameworks. We use all sorts of different sorts of areas of interest from very early years to lifelong learning. And so it is therefore at that level appropriate to characterise it as a field of study. But there's another way of asking questions about disciplines, and that's to ask them sociologically. The extent to which the discipline is established in qualifications, in buildings, in lectureships, in professorships, in journals, in conferences. And of course, from that point of view, it's absolutely clear that education is a very, very significant and robust discipline in the university world nowadays. One of the interesting things about asking questions about disciplines from a sociological point of view is you start to see that they are not self-given. They are actually a political project. People argue for them. People push them forward. They get knocked back. They are controversial activities in themselves inside the university world. And actually, I would argue that probably nowhere that political process gets illustrated better than the field of education, because it has been an enormous political project that is still very, very much live in terms of its debates about whether education is an appropriate discipline in the field in the university today. So I want to highlight that political process by talking about the discipline of education sociologically. I want to ask 4 anatomical questions. I've only got time to touch on them very briefly, but I want to ask very briefly where we come from as a discipline, where are we now, why are we shaped like we are with all of our strengths and our challenges, and where should we be in the future? The audacious one, really, to us, ourselves, I think. Another way of putting that is, how can we rescue the university project? That's the subtitle of the book, but I think, and it sounds somewhat alarmist, but I think it actually is. The challenges that are faced by the field of education as a discipline are very, very severe at the moment, not just in the UK, but in many, many parts of the world. So that's what I'm trying to do. No small feat to do in 3 quarters of an hour. I'm going to have a go to give you a flavour of some of my arguments. But where do we come from? Well, I would say there's probably you can trace the aspiration for education to be part of the university system for at least about 100 years. And in relation to the education of teachers, there have been 2 traditions. There is the majority tradition of what we would call the normal colleges. Normal colleges, originally religiously based colleges for the education of teachers in England, Wales and Northern Ireland. Here you can see the picture of one from London, Borough Road College. And this is the French notion of normal, which is normal, which means the college normal, which has a strong moral position about what it's trying to achieve in its educational processes. That was the dominant tradition for the majority of preparation of teachers. What we get from 1852 is the university system, or the emergent university system there is Owens College in Manchester, starting to play in the field of education. Owens College in Manchester started to offer evening classes for practicing teachers in the 1850s. And what you then get is from the 1890s onwards, about 20 or 22 of the established universities in England and Wales and Northern Ireland starting to develop what we call day training colleges, offering courses for teachers to become prepared as teachers once they've graduated. In Oxford we started around 1892, something like that. Queen's established its first professor in 1902. The university system was always a very small-scale system, much more the minority system for the preparation of teachers. The majority system was through the normal colleges, which were fairly austere places with relatively short amount of very direct training. Scotland had a very different tradition. It's always had very, very high, prestigious, intellectually rigorous colleges of education that saw themselves as different and in many ways equal to the world of the university. They didn't see themselves as an inferior institution in any sense at all. What I found interesting in looking at the history of this world was that there were 2 points in England and Wales where there was a serious attempt to bring the normal college tradition into the university world, both of which got scuppered for different reasons. In the 1920s, there was a strong movement led by the National Union, led by the Labour Party. Actually in their manifesto in the 1920s, they wanted to bring the teachers' colleges to the university sector. For better or worse, the teachers backed the national strike, and the government were absolutely horrified at the idea of having teacher education, and therefore the control of teachers, move out into the independent university sector. And that movement was then scuppered. You see the same sort of movements in 1947, after the war. The McNair report was set up to think about the future of teacher education. Now we had secondary school free for everybody. And what they came to the conclusion was that was a committee that was dominated by the vice chancellors. And although the government were relatively easy about the idea of teacher education moving into the university sector fully, it was actually the vice chancellors who were actually extremely nervous. And they were nervous about the very applied field getting involved in the loftier forms of knowledge that they were involved with. And they're also very nervous about a field which was very dominated by government control, being brought into the university sector. And therefore the vice chancellors kicked that into the long grass again then. So there's a really, really interesting series of politics about that. And of course the politics in Northern Ireland for the final resolution of that process, of course, is still going on. There's another history which is to do with research, which is a smaller parallel history, if you look back into the 19th century, it's actually in Scotland where you first get the appointments of professors of education, the idea of applying the principles that come out of the Enlightenment into the study of the field of education. And by the time you get into the 1920s, many universities, not just Queen's, many universities that had departments of education start to appoint professors for the first time. Right up until after the Second World War, they were nearly all concerned with educational testing, IQ measurement, those sorts of things. But there was the beginnings of the science of education for that sort of period of time. So a very interesting and rich and conflicted history to be told about our field and where it comes from, or where we come from, many of us who work in it. It really wasn't until 1963 that things really started to change with the Robbins report. Because Robbins wasn't just about higher education, Robbins was also about a whole special section on the education of teachers, who advocated that we should move teaching to become a graduate profession. And if we did that, we had to develop a degree level entry, Bachelor of Education, which had itself to be a professional course that was valuable in academic terms. And the answer was put forward by R.S. Peters and to a lesser extent by Paul Hurst, arguing that the way forward to do that was to establish the disciplines of sociology, psychology, philosophy and history, and that would give the backbone to professional education, which would make it degree worthy. What's interesting about that, if you read the history of that, is that what you actually have is an agreement about the structure of a new degree that was agreed across the whole length and breadth of the UK. So Great Britain and Northern Ireland all agreed that this new degree should have this common structure. It's actually almost kind of an unheard of thing nowadays, that anyone should agree on what that would be. But that was the power of Peters' thinking at the time. And so that idea, and actually the idea of that's what education ought to be, was actually spread much further than inside the UK. You also see a similar structure for education degrees in many parts of the Commonwealth as well. That idea, though, also then simulated a huge flurry of educational research. It burst out from being just being psychologically based. It burst out into being into the world of sociology and psychology and philosophy. And it also unleashed a huge demand, because there were now people teaching at degree level in the colleges. It pushed a great deal of demand for master's degrees and eventually for doctorate work and all sorts of things. It became a great stimulus for educational research. One of the things that Robbins was worried about, though, was that he was arguing that if teachers' colleges went to teaching at degree level, they need to be institutions that got out of under the thumb of government, that had the control of their own curriculum, that had an institutional autonomy of themselves. And he wanted to see them integrated into the university system, with some of the existing universities and into the new universities he imagined that would be formed. And he couldn't have believed, though, that it would take another 40 years for that to take place. It really wasn't until we get to 1992 that we actually start to see that story really come fully to fruition. You can say again, with the debates that are still going on in Northern Ireland, you can still see the working out of some of his principles from 1963, the final part of putting all the jigsaw together, and in making sure that we actually have a full system for education, which actually is profoundly based in research-led institutions. So, where are we now? Well, we've got 112 departments of education in the UK. You can divide it up in all sorts of different ways. Obviously, there's the pre-92 sector, and then there's the post-92 sector, and then there's University of Ulster, which is the only institution that actually crosses those boundaries in terms of its history. It's quite unique from that point of view. In the pre-92 sector, I divide them up as a rule of thumb in terms of the research elite. That's where the departments of education themselves are confident about their research profile. And they are very different if you go and visit them from those that are departments of education in old universities that are research insecure. They feel very different. In the post-92 sector, you get the ex-polytechnics, also of course here in Ulster, which again have a really, really different feel because they're institutions that are still based strongly in their community and have a strong vocational dimension to them. And then you get, particularly in England, you get the The new teachers' colleges, the ex-teachers' colleges have kind of changed themselves in the last 10 years. The most recent ones have become universities. Some of them I call the new entrepreneurs, really expanding, going to every single course opportunity available, becoming really substantial, diversified institutions in which education was the centre and is now shrinking in terms of proportion of what those institutions are like. And then there are some other smaller universities which the government characterises as teaching-only universities that they're kind of small liberal arts institutions. And there is research done there, but the government have looked at them as teaching-only universities. And they are also quite different. So you can cut the cake up in a whole variety of different sorts of ways. But what's interesting is if you do move around these different sectors, you realise how different education becomes as a theme, as it's instantiated in different sorts of institutions, has different lived realities for the staff and for the students, different understandings of what the enterprise is about. And it was very interesting choosing the sample of 10 institutions around these sorts of characteristics, and then going to visit them and comparing them and talking to people about what their curriculum was, what their life stories were of members of staff, how life was lived, how the students lived their life in different sorts of institutions. And there are very important differences in the field that we have. Just a bit about the individuals. I can't do much on it, but it's a very, very large social science in the UK. 5,200 academics. Only a third were entered the last RAE. We are older than other social scientists, and that's because many of us have dual careers in the teaching field before we come into education, universities. Compared with the rest of social science, it's a feminized field, 67% female. It's a very white and British field, which is really, really interesting. Compared with the other social sciences, education has not become more ethnically diverse. It has not become more diverse in terms of people's nationality as well, which is very interesting. Relatively low paid as well, you'd be interested to know. Education compared to the rest of social science has a smaller portion of people in the high levels of pay. Very, very important, the last couple of points there. There's 34% of those 5,000 people on teaching-only contracts. That's the highest proportion in any social science in the UK. And the lowest proportion of staff with doctorates is a high degree, highest degree. We might have a debate at the end ask why these things happen. So what you get is a segmented labour force, really. You've got an well-established group of better qualified people who are some of whom are quite well paid. They're on secure teaching and research contracts. There were 1,800 for the last RAE. That is still a bigger number than sociology and economics combined. It's as big as psychology. There are a large number of very well qualified, established academics, research academics in the field of education. It's just that is only a third of the system. There's a lot of people who are not in that, and that's the second part of that segmented group. Then a large group of less academically qualified staff, many on teaching only and insecure contracts. Just a few words about our teaching. This is really only about teacher education, this little slide, and there's more to say, but and that's because teacher education, well, until Michael Gove finally gets his hand on him in England, struggling going on at the moment, but it's certainly, at the moment, still 2/3 of the student numbers. And it's got lots and lots and lots of strengths. I mean, the reports that we get from our inspectorates across the UK are very, very positive indeed. There's no question about it. They're very positive. And the quality of the students, particularly in Scotland and Northern Ireland, is incredibly strong. And it's strong in postgraduate level in England as well, and it's strong in England in the 4-year degrees. I think there's some questions about student recruitment in the 3-year degrees inside England. I would have questions about it. It's also immensely popular with students. If you look at the feedback you get from students as well, some of the positive feedback that you get looking at them in England, the percentage of, you get newly qualified teachers saying, how well were you prepared? And you get overwhelmingly positive responses of something like 96% of students saying, yes, there were questions I've got, but my sum is I was very, very, very well prepared, very high quality preparation I've been engaged with. But there are some things on the other side of the coin. We've had 25 years of the turn to the practical in teacher education. In England and Wales, in particular, overwhelming government control, a strong pressure to become more and more instrumental in what we do. I think in Scotland and Northern Ireland, there is still, as Lynn was saying, there is still a greater emphasis on theory and reflection, but I still think that pressure has been there to actually make, even when there is space for theory and reflection, to actually move in more instrumental ways. And this has, I think, has major implications for the field, because if your courses and the courses that you teach are intended to be largely instrumental, it means that you must then recruit staff directly from school, that you must hold them accountable for their work of being engaged with schoolwork here and now in a very, very real sense. And there's influences for who you recruit, the sorts of professional development you make available to them, and the research aspirations that they have, which are again around the very practical business of school. So it shapes that shapes the discipline in very, very profound ways, and in many ways, in very good ways. But also, we can argue questions about whether that's sufficient or good. It also has implications because you then develop an institutional culture that feels very different from other disciplines as well, because it's so bound up. 2/3 of its teaching, it's staff straight from school. The professional development is around becoming more and more school relevant and engaged. It serves to drive a wedge between this discipline and other disciplines in some ways that sometimes is not always helpful. Just a bit about our research, the balance sheet. Well, there is some astounding work. It's astoundingly good work if you look at the report from the last RE panel. Very, very complimentary, very, very strong, talking about really excellent work, excellent policy work, a profile that's as good as any of the other social sciences you might want to compare it with in the best institutions, no question about that. And lots of very high profile work internationally. And it's immensely rich. There are over 600 refereed English language education journals in the world. Over 600 of them. It's just, and there are so many conferences, there are so many learned societies with interest in education. It's an incredibly rich field. And very dynamic in all sorts of ways. But we are nowhere near as successful as we should be in relation to the size. We are the second largest social science after business and administration. We are getting nowhere near the number of research council grants that we ought to. We recruit people directly from schools, and then we don't always, very largely don't give training opportunities to develop a research profile in relation to that. So some of our work is not of the highest quality. Sometimes we do use rather limited methodologies. And we are increasingly different from other disciplines. When I came into this business, I would go regularly to sociology conferences, and sociologists would come to sociology of education conferences, and many of us would because you teach with each other's programs. There is no way in which that is possible today. We live in quite separate worlds, which I think is actually to our detriment. You have to remember that at 1,600 out of 5,000. And we're dominated by applied work with the government as a funder. And that actually is important in many ways, because for better or worse, the government, of course, is now shrinking its funding, which is a problem in terms of maintaining our research profile. But it's a problem in another way, in that if we're dependent on that for much of our research funding, the peer review process is much weaker when you apply for government funding than if you're applying for European Union funding or if you're applying for research council funding. And those painful businesses to go through, but my goodness, don't learn how to sharpen your research when you do go through these things. So having a field which is overwhelmingly, about 80% of our research funding coming through government sources, actually has a washback effect on the quality of our research in complex ways, I think. So the overall diagnosis then, well, it's a segmented field. Segmented in terms of institutions, staffing, teaching, research. And significantly, I think it's a discipline that's often isolated from other disciplines in many respects. It's not actually in charge of its own destiny. So, why are we here then? I've got two answer. I can really only sketch these. But I think at the end of the 20th century, two things were starting to happen at the same time as education really arrived at the high table of the university system from 1992 onwards. Universities were changing in absolutely profound ways, and ways that actually have had an enormous effect on the field of education. The first is the development of what they call neoliberal higher education policy, where education has become bound up with ideas that the importance of increasing the number of students in higher education. But there's been not enough money to go around. The unit of resources shrunk in really, really significant ways. At the same time, as partly as a way of responding to that, the government has introduced competitive research assessment. We've had more than 20 years nearly 30 years of the REE and its different versions. We've also had a government's a way of dealing with that massification. There isn't enough money to go around. They've started to be not convinced that research is even essential for higher education. So the 2004 Education Act, which had consequences in 2006 onwards, said that you could actually imagine universities that didn't have a research profile. That, in reality, people have carried on doing research, but it's definitely that's government policy, and that's a way of them responding to this massification in terms of numbers and a reducing unit of resource. Another thing that's happened is that research itself has got increasingly tied up with international competitiveness for the country as a whole. There's been some really interesting things there. There has been more money around. It's shrinking, very much shrinking at the moment, but certainly in the 2000s there's more and more money around for educational research. But there was a kind of what you might call a new social contract for it, in that government increasingly became involved in defining the topics and defining the methodologies and increasing accountability with what the research there was. So you've got a number of different pressures on the university system. And the consequence is that chronic underfunding is that you have to become an entrepreneurial university. If you're a vice chancellor, if you're a head of department, and you're not fleet of foot in looking for the next opportunity and responding very sensibly and quickly to what the market wants of you, you will not be successful as an institution. You will not be successful as a faculty. You have to be entrepreneurial in a whole range of different sorts of ways. And that's had hugely important consequences for the field of education that I'll come back to in a minute. The other thing that happened at the same time as we were arriving in higher education is what, for summed up in just one paragraph, and Ron Barnett called collapse of certainty. That is your postmodernism bit. I'll read it to you there. The idea of objective knowledge is central to higher education, but from various theoretical quarters: philosophy of science, sociology of knowledge, epistemology, critical theory, post-structuralism. The idea of objective knowledge and truth has come under massive assault. Pragmatism, so what if anything is going to replace objective knowledge is unclear. Pragmatism, relativism, metacriticism, even anything goes, they're all proposed. The very diversity of the alternative options is testimony to the collapse of some of our basic epistemological tenets. The idea then that the university was a place that had a distinctive body of knowledge that only it professed, that it was a place where you could go to that knowledge, that idea has come under massive assault, and it's particularly problematic in a very applied field like education. And our confidence in that we've got something distinctive in terms of knowledge that other people simply don't have, that confidence, I think, has been profoundly eroded. So you put those two things together: shrinking of resources, the need to be entrepreneurial, and lack of certainty that we've got something in terms of knowledge that no one else has got. We have a number of consequences that I think affect the whole of universities. Of course they do, but they've affected education in a very, very important way. It has meant that the government's been able to be increasingly assertive in defining the teaching and the research that it wants to buy. And it's been increasingly difficult to argue back and say, well, we've got some important principles that we must insist on. The universities had to follow where the money is without the confidence to be able to say, this is what we've got, no, you've got these are our principles. And so it's had two different sorts of consequences. Successful departments have rapidly pursued alternative markets. international students, independent research grants. That gives you money and it gives you independence. You haven't got the government telling you this is how you should define education, this is how you define research, this is what you should teach. No wonder then deans and vice chancellors pursue these things. It's that gets them out of this very narrow track if they're in it. There's a particular effect. Well, what that does is increase stratification. It's the Matthew principle. Under the hat should be given more. And then, in particularly in a field like teacher education, where the main funder has been government, where they're in a very, very increasingly strong position to actually dictate what it is they precisely want. And teacher education, I think, across the UK, it's somewhat different here in Northern Ireland, but it's certainly the case in England and Wales. Questions also, I think, in Scotland as well. Teacher education has become increasingly downgraded as a university activity, and more intensified. There's been that casualisation of staff, the division of labour that I said you can get from that overall figure. So it's the coming together of that entrepreneurial university in the context of no longer feeling confident in what it is we've got, has had all these negative consequences in having to become immensely sensitive to what it is our funders want. And education has, different universities have some opportunity to stand outside that if they can get independent research grants, if they can get international students, but not all universities can do that. We operate in different markets. So, I think our crisis is that after 100 years of struggle to get into the university system, we had, I think, what I would call as a critical victory. So we're now overwhelmingly in the university, but too much of our teaching and our research is not of the university, or at least it's not recognised as such. Loads of brilliant things go on inside private classrooms and lecture theatres like this. But they're not necessarily what the government thinks it's paying for, I think. So, last bit then, Rescue the University Project. One of the problems we have, I think, is that when you say to people, what are you going to do about this fact that the government doesn't seem to believe that you're an important part of the university world, they say, well, we're really good. We meet all the government targets. I hear this in youth certificates, University Council for the Education of Teachers, I hear them all the time. What people very rarely do is articulate the common purpose of anything beyond the utilitarian. They don't say, this is what the university is giving that's distinctive. This is what we've got to offer, what we can bring to the party that actually is different from what anybody else could do. And it seems to me that that's one of the things that I think many, many disciplines need to be able to articulate in the very utilitarian world that we now live in. And I think it's very, very powerfully important for education. And I don't think that I've necessarily got the answer at all. What I'm trying to do is to stimulate a debate, saying, this is the question we've got to address. What is it that we've got that is distinctive, that we can contribute to the field of education, that others, in collaboration with other people, but what is it that we've got that's different? I'm pushed back to start to ask, well, what's a university anyway? Where I begin. And the thing about modern universities is that they're such a muddle of different ideas. If you listen just a little bit carefully, you can still hear in the senior common room, if you have a senior common room, somewhere among the motorists, but you can hear the voice of Newman, the idea of liberal education, the idea of for Matthew Arnold, universities about teaching the best that's been thought and said in the world and communicating that to the next generation. And that's really what's distinctive and important about the university. And you can still hear those arguments around, and they're still important ideas. A very different sort of idea of the university is that it's a research and specialist research institute where the real heart of it is professors working with their postgraduate students and producing new knowledge. That's not necessarily the same as a liberal education institution. There's another tradition, which goes right back to the medieval university, that universities are about professional education, about engaging with the world, but particularly, certainly the medieval university, of course in the field of theology and law, and then shortly after that into medicine. Or you can become from a different tradition again, from the civic university tradition, from David Hume, particularly an idea that emerges in Scotland, that the university is part of engaging with the real world. It's got to have accessible qualifications, it's got to be involved in the local community, in the local economy. Those ideas whisked out to Scotland and got involved in the American educational system, of land grant universities. But all those voices here, they're all, I bet you they're all in your university. People say that what this place is really about is all of these different sorts of things. And in the context of that multivocalism, you've actually got to say, well, can we then hang on to what it is the university is about? Is there an idea there? Is there still an idea of a university? I think there is, but I don't think it's around knowledge anymore. And that's because I think the business about being insecure that there is some form of knowledge that you can only get at the university and nowhere else, I think that's been blown out of the water. I think instead, the university's essential purpose is what I'm usually call the maximisation of reason or the contestability of knowledge. Because that idea of contesting knowledge, of questioning it, of debating it, of looking for evidence, of challenging it, that goes to the heart of our teaching, and it goes to the heart of our research. And there are many other institutions now engaged in research, schools engage in research, educational systems engage in research, industry engages in research. But this idea of the contestability of knowledge is not at the heart of what they do. It's not their essential purpose. They're doing this as an addition. And it's about saying that, yes, we know that any knowledge that we produce will be temporary, will be challenged in 5 or 10 years' time. It will atrophy over time as school systems change, as curriculums change. The world changes in all sorts of ways. But that commitment to testing, to debating, to looking for evidence, to challenging, that is something, it's a process that actually goes to the heart of what a university does. And it makes universities quite unique in society. Really, really unique in society. And let's be if all of those of you who work in a university are incredibly privileged to work in an institution with that as its core value. In recent years, a number of people, particularly Martha Nussbaum, but also Stefan Collini and others, have argued that we've got to protect the humanities, because the humanities are where these values sit most importantly, and we've got to protect humanities from the utilitarianisation of the university world. If we don't do that, we'll lose something of our civilization. Now, I think the humanities should be protecting. But what we have to do in education, we have to win the argument that a discipline, an applied discipline like ours, still needs the maximisation of reason. It still needs an idea of contesting knowledge. It still needs to have that with what it's about as well. It isn't just that you can have the humanities protected with everybody debating everything, and then you've got everybody else, they can get on with the business of being practical and utilitarian and not ask hard questions. We have to win the argument that it's just as important in a vocational field like education as it is in the humanities. It's just as important in applied research as it is in pure research. But those are hardly arguments to win, but they're the arguments that we do have to win. Okay, 3 points then. This idea that we ought to be retooling our discipline. And there's not a complete list at all. But I'm talking about retooling for professional education, retooling for knowledge mobilisation, and retooling for research. Professional education, I still think it's an important part of what we do, and it's going to remain so. It may change in its form, particularly in England, but initial teacher education is in the process of shrinking quite substantially. Might even disappear from the university sector for all I know. But I think professional education of different sorts still be a very important part of what we do. We need clear arguments, though, about what the contribution of the university is to professional education. A whole range of different people have tried to capture that. Eric Hoyle talked about extended professionality. Marion Cotton-Smith talks about expanded professionalism. Paul Hurst talked about, well, borrowing from Matthew Arnold, he said, talked about being exposed to the best that's been thought and said in education. He talks about the development of practical theories. There's a whole range of different ways in which you can think about what university their contribution is in our field. But I think, however you characterise it, I think what's important to recognise is that it's not just our contribution, it's not just intellectual. When you get people to reflect on their practice, to look at evidence, to assess what they're doing, to bring it into critical review, they're doing more than just the intellectual thing. They're doing what Aristotle would call phronesis. They're starting to develop practical wisdom. Because practical wisdom involves the ability to, has a moral dimension to it. And I think professional education has a strong moral dimension to it. It involves the ability to reflect and achieve good ends defined by the community. In this case, the teaching community. That strong ethical dimension. So it goes much further than other sorts of higher education. I think that's why it's so big and difficult to do in professional education. You're not just giving people ideas, you're actually changing them as people, and there's a moral dimension to the world that you're engaging with them too. So those are quite different things. It's not just education, it's all sorts of professional education is involved in these sorts of things. When you're doing more than intellectual work, you are changing people and you're introducing them to a moral community. But I think you're going to have to ask two questions. Why does teachers need this practical wisdom? And I think you can argue from the university's point of view, I think it's unlikely to be persuasive. For me, the more persuasive argument is that kids in the world that they're entering such a complex world in terms of rapidly changing technology, exploding knowledge, huge mobility in terms of society and values, but they've got themselves, whatever Michael Gove says, they have to have an education that makes them think critically about what they're being told, that makes them understand differences in values, that helps them recognise differences in interpretations. They've got to develop the skills to make their own judgment in this immensely complex and mobile world that we live in. That's what the kids need. If the kids need that, then my goodness, we have to win the argument, and of course then the teachers have to have those sorts of values in their professional education in a very, very important way. But do universities need to be involved in that? Well, I think schools are absolutely essential contributors. Universities cannot do this stuff on their own, and I would have arguments within a degree in which your current system here in Northern Ireland engages systematically and sustained in different ways in professional education within schools. But universities themselves, though, do have something to bring to the table, something that is distinctive. They are repositories of a wide range of examples, the best that's been thought and said in education, and they have at their core this principle of the maximisation of reason. They have at their core this idea of the accessibility of knowledge. And that's what they can bring to professional education that's distinctive. And that's a key part in developing this practical wisdom. But it is practical. It does also mean strongly engaging in the real world of schools. It's how you bring those two things together. I think, I'm not sure how effective we are in doing that at the moment. Have we got the right institutional structures to do that? To develop what you might call a kind of research-informed clinical practice. What I do know is that there's dreadful figures about casualised and part-time staff. Every time you casualise staff who are in the front line of professional education, you undermine our very claim to have something distinctive to offer. You're cutting them off from that culture that says you're part of a scholarly culture, and that's what you're bringing to the table. You're undermining that every time you do that. Okay, retooling for knowledge mobilisation. We spend an awful lot of money in this country in educational research, about 80 million quid a year. It's shrinking at the moment, but it's still an awful lot of it. And the dominant rationale, if you go to an educational conference, people actually see themselves as working in an applied field. They want to make a difference. They really want to make a difference. But the impact of what we do as researchers is really, really hard to show. And therefore, governments have all sorts of questions about whether they work. We're also highly applied. Many universities are quite snooty about highly applied research. They much spend their time doing loftier and high-powered sorts of things. So you get caught in from both directions, really. I think we have to win the argument. We can't just wait for 25 years for ideas through this concept of knowledge creep. Who's a sociologist of knowledge and then I've forgotten at the moment, coined this phrase. Carol Weiss. And she says it takes 25 years for ideas out of the universities to change the question. And that's what we do you change the question, you don't necessarily give the answer, but it becomes common sense that you should look at this in a different sort of way. We haven't got 25 years. We haven't got 25 years. People like Michael Gibbons, David Hargreaves and others, they're arguing that actually institutions don't need universities anymore. They need to go on and produce the knowledge themselves. Schools need to do this. Local authorities need to do this. Industry needs to go on and produce the knowledge themselves. And the shift is a big shift in government policy and European Union policy as well. And actually see knowledge production happening out there, not in places like this. So if we want to hang on to research, we've got to be much better at mobilising what it is we have got, it seems to me. Much better than we are. I think we're too often too complacent, we have conferences, I think we've done what's needed. And for a discipline that largely justifies itself to itself as being applied, that simply isn't good enough, it seems to me. There's no simple answer. We have to think much more about action research, and there's a strong tradition in the UK in education, but it needs developing further. We need to think much more about how you get practitioners involved in designing research questions, in thinking through the research from the very beginning. We had a big initiative funded by the ESRC that finished 7 or 8 years ago, the Teaching and Learning Research Programme, in which we learned a huge amount about how you would build people in to asking the right research questions in the first place, how you would engage with communities. We need to be much more savvy about working with knowledge brokers. Now, I'm really nervous about think tanks, but actually it's think tanks that policymakers listen to, not academic researchers. They're with them routinely. You look at the networks and connections. We need to be working with people like the think tanks who actually have those connections in a way that we find really hard to do. And I think we also have to think about whether we've got the structures right. I put up Future Lab. It's just an example, a really interesting example of an institution built in Bristol. It's now gone, or virtually gone. But it was an interesting initiative because it tried to break the boundaries. It was an institution doing fundamental research on new technologies and learning, funded by the government, funded by the new technologies industry, very close to Bristol University, but not part of it. So it went across all these boundaries. And it was able to do things, really serious research, very respectable academic research, but it broke boundaries that would be very, very hard for universities to do. I'm not saying they got the answer right, but it was an interesting experiment. And I don't know whether we were all our structures right in terms of being able to engage with industry, to be engaged with government, to engage with the profession. It's a hard question, I think, for us there. Final one, very final one, retooling for research. We've got to continue getting better at our research and education. We need a broad-based range of methods. We're still incredibly weak in quantitative methodologies, and that is the research discourse of the day, and if we're not able to articulate clearly, to engage clearly with that, we are constantly marginalised. We've got to open up our research to other disciplines. I said my sense is of our discipline becoming increasingly closed away from other disciplines. We've also got to broaden our research agenda. There are educational questions around all of that. And what is important to note for us, and salutary for us, if you were government and wanting to form or renew a research team looking at the impact, the impact of social, of ageing on the community, and there will be educational as well as medical questions around there. You are funding research. Would they be turning to education departments to contribute to an interdisciplinary project like that? The chances are not, it would seem to me. All of these different sorts of questions are interdisciplinary, multidisciplinary questions. And increasingly the European Union in particular, and driving the UK government, are pushing towards more interdisciplinary questions. And if we're not able to get ourselves engaged in those debates, because anyone can do the education bit, then that's going to be a hugely lost opportunity for us. But we are very narrow in the sorts of things that we think we're experts at. So it's just, as I said, agree with what I said, the research agenda is changing, I think. But certainly impact is not going to go away. But we have to think hard about interdisciplinarity. We have to demonstrate that we can contribute to these changing national and international debates. Finally, I think we have to recognise and face up to the fact that doing research is absolutely central to what I try to define as the university project. Only if faculties of education themselves develop strong, inclusive research cultures, can you ensure that that principle of the maximisation of reason stays at the core of your faculty as well as your university? When teaching by core staff is undertaken by staff who become casualised or excluded, it undermines the very legitimacy of saying we have something distinctive to offer. So research is not just important in itself, it's about how you actually maintain what it is that's distinctive about the university. It's the bread and butter that actually makes the thing work in the first place. And I think every Vice-Chancellor, every Dean of Education needs to take that message on board very seriously for themselves. The real university, this is I've got Percy, a philosopher and social commentator, 1770s. The real university is a state of mind. It's that great heritage of rational thought that's been brought down to us through centuries, which doesn't exist in a specific location. It's a state of mind which is regenerated throughout the centuries by a body of people who traditionally carry the title of lecturer or professor. But even that title is not part of the real university. The real university is nothing less than the continuing body of reason itself. Thank you.
We have a